we are in the season of centennial observances for what we now call the First World War. We didn't call it that back then because we didn't know there was going to be a second one. So back then it was known as the Great War, the war to end all wars. 100 years ago, April the 6th, the United States entered the war, some 3 years after everybody else had got going. And a century ago this very day, Canadian forces and other British imperial forces were in what became known as the Battle of Vimy Ridge, which began on April the 9th. And 4 days later, the Canadians took a hill in France that doesn't seem terribly important now, in northern France, in the Pas-de-Calais, from the Germans. It was a decisive Canadian victory. The men who were responsible for devising it were General Byng, Julian Byng, who later, as Lord Byng of Vimy, was Governor General of Canada in the 20s. And the actual fighting general, as it were, was General Sir Arthur Currie, one of the great, all-time great Canadian generals, all guts and gaiters, as they used to call him. A century ago is a long time, and we live in the whir of the present tense. And it is sometimes hard even to imagine how things were 100 years ago. The real heavy lifting was done not by General Byng nor by General Currie, but by ordinary men, Canadian men, volunteers, scrambling out of their trenches and attempting to take a few square yards of barren sod from the Germans in their trenches. There's been nothing as awful as the trench warfare of the Great War in the century since. And I said they were men. They would now be in the early stages of the protracted adolescence that in most Western societies lasts until what we used to call early middle age. They were 16, 17, 18, 19 years old. Just shy of 3,600 of them died in the first, in the 4 days of that battle. Something like 11,000 wounded. And that's 3,600 out of a population of 8 million Canadians at the time. For the purposes of comparison, that's like the total war dead, American war dead in Iraq over many years, and out of a population of over 300 million. The casualties at Vimy reached into almost every community across Canada. As I said, it's the centenary, and we find it hard even to imagine what it was like to be a teenager scrambling over that trench 100 years ago. So one is always nervous about the centennial observances on such occasions. The big speakers on this occasion were His Royal Highness the Prince of Wales and Justin Trudeau, Canada's 12-year-old Prime Minister. And it is always potentially perilous when either man speaks in public. So my expectations were low. And I have to say, as antipathetic to my future sovereign and my present Prime Minister as I am, that nevertheless they did not embarrass themselves in the words they found to mark the occasion. The total, pitiful, pathetic, disgraceful embarrassment was François Hollande, invited to participate as the President of France. If you've never been to the Vimy Memorial and you are in the Pas-de-Calais part of France, you should go and see it. It's very moving. It's simple. A lot of the land that was given for it is actually not safe to walk around because it's still full of unexploded munitions. But you can start by going in the trenches and actually getting some sense of how these poor young soldiers spent their days and nights. There's a little thing they do where they effectively lower the lighting to what it would have been with lanterns in 1917, and you can't see, just as a tour group, you can't see the tourist in front of you. You get a real sense of what it would have been like in 1917. And this land was given by the government of France. King Edward VIII, one of his few public engagements in his short reign, opened it in 1936 as Canada's Vimy War Memorial. And when France was occupied by the Germans, there was a lot of thought that the Nazis would destroy it. It's a monument to a Canadian victory over the Germans. But Hitler, when he visited occupied France, toured Vimy and found it profoundly moving, which is a disquieting sentiment because it humanizes Hitler. And people don't want to humanize Hitler. In fact, he was very human. He was a monster, but he was a very human monster. So Hitler did not destroy the Vimy War Memorial. And in recent decades, as Canada's veterans from that war have aged and then departed this earth entirely, it has taken on an even greater significance. We say that the Battle of Vimy was the moment when Canada became a nation. So that's why His Royal Highness the Prince of Wales and Monsieur Trudeau were there, and that's why they invited François Hollande, the President of France, also to make some remarks. And his remarks were as bone-crushingly idiotic and insulting as anything I have ever heard. Here's part of what he said.
C'est ce que nous faisons quand nos pays s'engagent pour répondre aux appels des réfugiés du Moyen-Orient qui cherchent une terre d'asile loin de l'oppression.
Yeah, that's right. His argument is that it was the courage and valor of these Canadian soldiers taking this godforsaken hill in northern France 100 years ago that has led to us embracing and welcoming Syrian refugees from all over and hearing the call of these Syrian refugees from all over the Middle East 100 years later. That's what these Canadian farm boys were fighting for 100 years. The right for Muslims to come and live on European welfare and pretend to be 17 years old. That's what Canadians, that's the old fighting spirit. That's what was riling them up and getting them to sail across the ocean and fight 100 years ago. Brilliant. Then I thought that's good. He's got a brilliant writer, but he's never going to cap that. And then he did.
Nous nous battons ensemble pour préserver la planète. Et c'est ensemble que nous avons voulu l'accord de Paris sur le climat.
Yeah, that's right. That's what they were fighting for too. A great agreement at the climate change conference in Paris last year. That's what they were struggling for. Because when you're in the trenches up to your neck in muck and bullets, it was snowy, it was winter that day. So it was a real priority. They were looking around saying, oh, sure, there's snow everywhere now, and we're having to scramble across this godforsaken bit of no man's land without getting gunned down by the Germans in snow. In snow, have you ever tried running across snow while you're being shot at by Germans? But even so, they were thinking, but you know, in 100 years' time, the planet will have warmed up and there won't be any snow, and that would be a tragedy, because the next time they're having a big world war, there won't be a bit of snow on the ground. And so they were fighting so that the world could reach agreement at the Paris Climate Conference. And then he capped it all, Monsieur Hollande, Monsieur le Président de la République Française, with this.
Oui, les soldats de Vimy nous disent que le nationalisme ne mène qu'à la guerre et que le fondamentalisme à la destruction.
Yep. War is nationalism, nationalism is war. He's a little bit off message there, because the message from Monsieur Trudeau and His Royal Highness the Prince of Wales is that Vimy was the moment when Canada became a nation. Canada entered the Great War as just some little colony and then ended the Great War as a mature nation. But Monsieur Hollande saying, Nationalism is war, war is nationalism, we must all be united. That's the message of Vimy. And one can have debates about whether it's true that Canada became a nation at Vimy. There's arguments about that, certainly in Quebec. But it's a little bit off message, I would say, to say that if Canada did become a nation, that's a bad thing because nationalism is war, which was Monsieur. So he gets the trophy for the most stupid speech of the day. If it is the case that this is the moment when modern Canada came into being, I did not get that vibe as a whole from the ceremony. I found the readings moving. I found the speech from the heir to the throne and the Prime Minister okay. There was in between a lot of schlocko, soft rock, pop pap, rendered even worse by interpretative dance. If you don't know interpretative dance, when we were live on stage in Ottawa, I did a few seconds of mock interpretative dance of Conservative Party leadership candidates renegotiating NAFTA with Donald Trump in interpretative dance. There's not a lot to it. Interpretative dance is dance for people who can't dance. So you just go like that. You just go like... So we had all these schlocko rock songs that these poor Canadian veterans had to sit through, while the gentlemen of the chorus were all twirling their arms like that. There's never a German artillery barrage around when you need it, is there? Twirling their arms like that. I can do without interpretative dance. I can do without soft rock. It's interesting to me, even a military ceremony, you can't do without. It's as if it's, oh, the kids won't be able to relate to it until you have some third-rate Bob Dylan impersonator who should have hung up his guitar in 1968 doing something in the show. And it reminds you, in fact, that as much as the case is made that this is where modern Canada was born, it in fact reminds you that we are not those men. That, as I said, the young men asked to do what they did. They weren't fighting for climate change. They weren't fighting for Muslim refugees to come and settle and demographically transform every major European city. And if you were to mention such a proposition to them, they'd have regarded it as completely absurd. They weren't fighting for abstract principles. Not to pick on the future king, but His Royal Highness suggested that they were somehow fighting against tyranny and oppression. I don't think that's true. They were fighting because they were fighting for Canada, and Canada was at war. And that's most of the reason why countries good and bad fight. The Germans fought valiantly in both wars, even though they were on the wrong side, because they were fighting for Germany. When the Germans invaded Russia, the Russians fought valiantly, not because they're communists and they were fighting for communism and Leninism and Marxism and Stalinism and any other ism. They fought because they were fighting for Mother Russia. In fact, that is the reason why most people fight, and most people fight effectively, because they are fighting for their homeland. And in that sense, Monsieur Hollande may have a point in that nationalism is war and war is nationalism, but effective war fighting is not for abstract principles, not for climate change, not for Muslim refugees, but because your country is at war and you are fighting for your country. And we find that hard to understand. As I read Monsieur Hollande's remarks and I look at the valor of those men, boys, as we would say, boys in law, 16 and 17 years old, but men by any standard from 100 years ago, and I look at what we've become, I wonder about the journey we have made in the last century. The First World War doesn't resonate for Americans in the same way. America was in it a very short time and never suffered the scale of losses that the great powers did, and so it doesn't seem a significant war in the same way that the American Civil War or the Second World War are. It's one that has kind of slipped from popular consciousness. But it was the most consequential war of our time. We live in the world made by the Great War, by the First World War. At the end of it, almost all the major European empires lay in ruins. The Russian Empire, the German Empire, the Austrian Empire, and the Turkish Empire. And the scale of the slaughter, because although it was Canadians who took that hill, there were troops from all over the empire there. There were Indian troops, there were South African troops. The scale of the slaughter destroyed the moral authority of the West. And in a sense, a big part of the anti-colonial struggle of the post-Second World War era came from men who had grown up in European colonies after the First World War and felt that the Great War had demonstrated the Europeans' argument about the superiority of Western civilization no longer applied. If these guys were so smart, why had millions and millions of people died for a war whose causes nobody could explain? So the First World War had consequences for the rapid decolonization in the 50s, 60s, 70s that has had consequences for us today. But in a broader sense, it actually destroyed the Western leadership class's own self-confidence. It actually hollowed out a generation's belief in itself. And if you look at the self-loathing, for example, that you can detect in almost any Western university these days, the civilizational self-loathing, which they are now imparting to generation after generation of student, that has its roots in the catastrophe of the Great War, of the First World War. In geopolitical terms, we live in the world as remade in the rubble of the Great War. For example, the other day, Donald Trump bombed Syria. Syria is a dictatorship run by the butchers of the Assad family. How did they have a country to run? Well, they had a country to run because there was a thing called Syria. Where did Syria come from? Well, it came from the Anglo-French carve-up of 1922, when the British wound up getting Palestine and what's now Jordan and Iraq, and so the French wanted a sphere of influence too, so they wound up with Syria. There is no such thing as Syria. It's something a couple of colonial civil servants cooked up for lunch after a wet Tuesday afternoon. And we live with the consequences of those invented states in the Middle East today. We live in the consequences of the First World War in the Balkans too. The reason Yugoslavia wound up imploding and falling into civil war in the 1990s, it was an invented state created after the collapse of the Habsburg and Ottoman empires. Why is Putin saber-rattling? Because after the First World War, Tsarist Russia was destroyed, Soviet communism came along instead. It lasted one lifespan. It lasted 7 decades, and then it collapsed. And Russia is trying to find something to be. Russia would like to be Mother Russia again, would like to be Tsarist Russia again. And Putin, in his present energies, is trying in some sense to go back to find a pre-communist model of Russia that works for him. All over the map, we live with the consequences of the First World War, because it was the war that unraveled the order that had prevailed in Europe since the revolutions of 1848. And if you look at that period, the second half of the 19th century and the first 14 years of the 20th century, it was in some ways the greatest, most peaceful, most advanced, most scientifically dynamic era in which the world has ever lived. All the things we now take for granted, aeroplanes, the automobile, the telephone, the electric light bulb, all came from that era of geopolitical peace between 1848 and August 1914. And that unraveled the map and put this rather unsatisfactory map of FACO statelets like Syria and Iraq and Jordan and Saudi Arabia in its place. And that map we have spent the last 20 years unraveling, from the Soviet Union at the beginning of the 90s to Yugoslavia a couple of years later, to the implosion of the Middle East dictatorships in the Arab Spring, the conversion of Libya into a totally failed state whose ports are run by ISIS. We are living in the long shadows of the Great War still. With this difference, as Monsieur Hollande made clear, we are not those 17 and 18-year-old farm boys who understood deep in their chest that they were fighting for king and country and they didn't need lofty ideals. No, according to Monsieur Hollande, now we fight, or we pretend to fight, or we have meetings or hashtags or blog posts for climate change and Syrian refugees. And in that journey, from the primal sense of self-preservation on Vimy Ridge a century ago to Monsieur Hollande's blatherings about climate change and Syrian refugees, is the degeneration of Western self-confidence. What Monsieur Hollande is telling us when he tells us that nationalism is war is that Europeans in particular have nothing to die for, nothing they're willing to die for. And as Europe is discovering too, there's a corollary to that. A people who have nothing to die for have nothing to live for, which is why they wind up barren, as Europe is, and surrendering their continent to invaders in a way that they would not have countenanced in the Pas-de-Calais a century ago. We'll see you next time.